Welcome to Bypassing Validation Rules Through Automation. My name is Aaron Crear. I'm founder and principal of Hattrick Consulting. We're a registered Salesforce consulting partner. We work with companies around the world to help them achieve their Salesforce goals through administration, development, and training services. And just give you a little background about myself, why I'm here. And because Salesforce changed my life. I am a recovering sales director. That's when I first started using the platform about a decade ago as a sales rep sitting in a cubicle, logging calls, creating opportunities. Then about 3 years ago, I decided that I was kind of sick of that, didn't want to do it anymore, but really loved Salesforce and made the switch to focus on the tech side. So I speak at a lot of these events around the world, mainly because I feel really lucky that I was able to make that transition. Salesforce, with Trailhead has really helped with that, as well as I've had some great mentors, people I've met at user groups and events like this. So this is kind of my way of trying to help other people. I run the Lowell, Massachusetts Salesforce admin group, and I'm also the co-organizer of Northeast Streamin', which is, ironically enough, Monday and Tuesday of this week, which is a similar event we had in New Hampshire. So I can tell you, go see the sponsors because they're essential to these. The ticket prices cover a very small amount of the budget for these events, so make sure the sponsors feel like they're appreciated for being here. All right, we'll get going here. So the title of this probably sounds a bit contradictory, right? We're bypassing validation rules. The whole point of those rules are to enforce something. So why are we bypassing them? Truthfully, I'd never thought of it until a few months ago. One of my customers had this issue and wanted me to find a solution for it, and this is where this whole presentation kind of evolved from. So the validation rules are there really to help with data hygiene, enforce business practices, but we've all seen those sales reps slamming their hand on their desk when they're trying to log something and they get an error message. Now they have to refresh the page, go back, do one thing, only to go back in, refresh the page again, and do the second thing, right? Drives them nuts. So this was one of the reasons that my client had this issue. So before we start, how many people here are admins? Developers? Good mix of both. Okay, cool. So I'm going to show you two separate use cases. They're similar but different, and two very different solutions to solve this problem. Both are completely declarative. There's no code. I do not know how to code, but I'll walk you through kind of the steps of these. So the first use case was the client had a field on the contact. It was contact status. They did not want the reps to be able to manually change that field. They only wanted that to be updated based on activity. Okay, they're tracking almost like marketing metrics. Is it an SAL, an SQL, that sort of stuff. So they didn't want the rep to just be able to willy-nilly go in there and decide what they wanted to set that to. So when they told me this, I'm like, oh, that's really simple. I already had the solution in my head. Put in a validation rule that prevents them from editing that field. Then I'll make that field read-only on the page layout, and then we'll add the automation that basically does the work for them. I'm like, that's going to be really simple. Not so much, because with the automation, the user is actually the one firing that. So if they don't have edit access to the field, it's going to fail. Even if we try to make the field read only on the page layout, the automation's still going to hit on that validation rule. So it was really two separate issues that didn't allow that to work. But we're lucky enough we're able to find another way around that to kind of bypass them both. So for this solution, we have one validation rule, 4 custom fields, and 3 process builders involved. So it became a lot more complex than I was expecting right off the bat. And solution number 2 for the next use case is a lot simpler than this, so don't be alarmed. I'll preface this. I created this before I knew how to use Flow. So the second one's going to use Flow. I had no idea how to use Flow when I did this. So we have some custom fields, and these are on the contact object. The first one's bypass validation. We have fire process builder, SAL task, SQL task. Those second 2, they're really specific for this criteria. You could essentially use anything, but the first 2 would be needed to kind of replicate this in one of your own orgs. We then have a validation rule, and it's just saying that we don't want that contact status field to be changed unless bypass validation field is set to true. So how many people in here have written validation rules? Oh, most people, okay. So I'm sure you've all written a validation rule that says, show this error unless user profile equals system administrator. Same thing we're doing here. We're just kind of building in a loophole into our validation rule to make sure we have a kind of a way to get through it. So the first process builder is going to set the bypass validation rule field to true, which essentially just nullified our validation rule. It's no longer going to work while that box is true. This is going to run on the task object for this scenario. It could run in the event if you're doing the same type of thing for tasks and events, so whether they're logging a call versus scheduling a meeting, or it could run on both. For this example, I'm just going to show you how it's done on the task. So essentially, when they log some sort of call or do some sort of task, this would fire and basically check that box on the contact record that now says, okay, bypass the validation rule, let them do whatever they want. Process builder number 2, which runs on the contact, is what actually updates the contact status. So the criteria for this basically is that bypass validation field is checked. That's our criteria. And then it's going to update the contact status as well as either that SAL task or SQL task checkbox. Those checkboxes are really only there to tell it what status to move it to. And I have a demo of this, so it'll be clear when you see that, I'm sure. But that's really, the checkboxes are only there just to dictate what specific status to move it to. So that will then fire process builder number 3, which is clearing the checkboxes and reestablishing the validation rule itself, right? Because we want to make sure we lock that record back up once we've done everything we needed to. So this one is really just looking at the bypass validation field is true, and now that fire process builder field is true. You could call that whatever you named. I don't know why I called it that, to be honest with you, but you could call the second one anything. But it's really just there to fire this third process builder, which then re-enables your validation rule. Okay, so just to recap those, process builder number 1 disables your validation rule, making the record editable. Process builder number 2 updates that contact status field, which is originally locked. And then process builder 3 re-enables your validation rule. So 3-step process for something that should be a lot simpler, but that's kind of how we got through this. So we will take a look at our demo. And you'll see the first thing I'm going to do, we're going to try and manually edit that contact status field. And we'll get our validation error there right up top, telling us you're not allowed to do that. We'll refresh our page, and then we'll log some activities to see if we can actually hurdle that fence. So we're going to log our call or task. And based on this result field, there's 2 options. That determines if that SAL or the SQL checkbox get checked. And it's just a straight correlation to what status it should go to in step 2. So we can see there it successfully updated the record for us. We'll log our second one to the other result, and we should have an SQL on our hands once this is done. There we go. Now we'll manually try and edit that field again, just to prove that our validation rule was re-enabled. And we get our error message again. Is that clear to everybody? Cool. All right. Use case number 2, similar. We want to prevent a customer service rep from moving a case into a status called working. So same type of scenario, we want to prevent them from moving a status. This one will be a bit different because this one's going to use flow to do a lot of the heavy lifting for us. So first thought solutions, identical to the first, right? We can't just put the validation rule in there because then the automation can't update it. We can't just make it read-only on the page layout because then the automation can't update it. And the automation would hit the validation rule if we leave the field editable, but don't have some other way around it. So if we don't have that bypass in there, then the automation runs into a wall as well. So our actual solution is one validation rule. We have one custom field, one process builder, and one flow. And the process builder is literally only there to launch the flow. It does nothing else. So we've reduced the amount of automation we have. We went from 3 pieces now to 2, which is obviously a better thing if we can limit how many different things are running at once. And the flow eliminates the need for some of those other fields as well. So we're consolidating not only field usage, but automation usage as well. So custom field, same bypass validation that we had on the contact, we're now using on the case. That's the only field we need for this. And again, that's just going to disable the validation rule and allow us to make the status update. Then we have our validation rule that's simply locking that, not allowing somebody to move the case status unless bypass validation equals true, same as the first scenario. Then we have our process builder. And again, this is just going to launch the flow itself. So again, you could have this run on tasks and events or both. This is just running on tasks. And what it's looking at is basically when a specific type of task is logged, that allows this to kick off. This runs on the task, and really the only criteria is going to be that validate bypass field being true. So our flow is going to do everything else. So it's going to set the bypass field, it's going to change the status, and then it's going to remove the bypass field. So it's going to disable the validation rule, it's going to update the status, and then it's going to re-enable. So the 3 steps we had in the previous scenario, 3 separate process builders, this one flow is doing all 3 of those. So those of you who haven't used it, I highly suggest invest the time in flow because it is so much more powerful than process builder. It really does a lot of things, and it is complex to learn. I stayed away from it for quite a long time because just for that issue, like I was really comfortable with process builders, but didn't really know how to start with flow. But once you understand how to use it, it really is a valuable tool. And we can see here in our flow, I'll actually just open it up at the end, but we have 3 components basically. We're updating a case, we're pausing, and then we're removing the bypass. And I'll open this up afterwards and show you what those look like. So we'll take a peek here at our demo. Again, we're going to try and manually move that field. Run into our validation error. And this is a specific use case, so their reps can't put it into that working field. They require every case that comes in gets a call from somebody from customer service, and this is the type of task that's going to be logged to this. So they literally don't let that stage move until somebody's logged that activity. They have that kind of personal touch approach where they want somebody to physically call them and not just reply back to the email. So we have our case response call as our type. Make sure we log it to the contact. And then we'll put in our notes or comments, which really is irrelevant. It's just that type field that is required for this criteria. And we're saved. We can see that moved. All right. So let me open up an org here, and we'll show our case. So if we're looking at our process builder, again, just running on the task, we're running it on creation or edit, just saying that the the task has been completed, and it's that case response call type. That's the only criteria in here. And when that happens, it's going to launch our flow. The only thing being passed in from the flow is the what ID. So from that task, what associated record is coming through, and it's mapped to case ID within the flow itself, because we're only doing this when these are related to cases, which really wouldn't occur anyways, because that type field would be different if you were logging tasks on different objects. We'll take a look at our flow. So step one is we're going to update the case. So we're on the case object, conditions met, we're just saying that the record ID equals that case ID, which is passed in from our process builder. Right? Anytime you use a flow launched from a process builder, you have to map those IDs. That's really the only thing you have to do in that section on a process builder, but you got to tell it what record to start with. In a flow, you can go look for other records, but it's always just simpler if you can pass it through, because one record is going to launch the flow to do something to either itself or another related record. So anytime you can just pass those variables through, it just works. It'll save you a couple of steps inside your flow. Then it's going to basically do field updates. So even it said field values for the case records, it's going to set that bypass validation to true, and it's going to set the status to working. So it's doing what process builder number 1 and number 2 did. It's doing right in this one element. Then we have a pause here. And this was really important, and this is something that when I first started building this, I was running into errors here, and I couldn't figure out why. So we just did 2 updates, right? We bypassed the validation. We updated the case. Our third action needs to re-enable that. You can't do it all in that first component, because you're going to run into an error, because you're essentially running over each other. You need this pause because the actual save record, the saving of the update to the record, doesn't become established in the system, in the database, until either your flow has completed or you add a pause here. So by adding this pause, that bypass field is now set to true, saved. Case status has been moved, saved. Now we can go update and reestablish our validation rule. When you try and do them all in the same component, you're not going to be able to. So it's really important that you add pauses. So anytime you need to do something that you want to kind of save and then have it either make a decision or do something else after that, just add a pause in there. This is also important to do because I wanted to make sure it was like real time, right? We're opening that gate, letting people come through, do what they want to those records. We want that to be as short as possible. So by doing it this way, it's essentially almost running in real time. And we can see here, and when we decide when we want to resume our event, we have hours. The offset number is 0. If you just type basically 0.01 in there, it'll still show as 0 in that field, but it's essentially going right through. So it's not quite real time, but it's almost real time. So now that we've had the first 2 record updates saved there, our last step is to re-enable our validation rule, which we can do here. And it's the same condition. Record ID equals that case ID passed in from the process builder. And now we're just updating that bypass validation field equal to false. Now our record's locked again. So really a big difference, the outcome is the same from these 2 scenarios, but it was really eye-opening to me when I understood how to do it with a flow, because now I've gotten rid of some fields that were only there for those process builders, which I don't need. Reducing the amount of automation running, right? So we don't have that risk of something else firing these and then they recursively write over each other. And you're able to do a bunch of things in different steps that, don't have to be completely separate processes. So I was really interested once I kind of figured this out, how else I could use it. Some other tips when you do stuff like this, turn field history tracking on for the fields you're using to launch this automation. Really helped with debugging and troubleshooting, and both of these scenarios took me a little bit of time. I had errors I was working through. Develop audit reports, so you have the field history tracking on those. Create a couple of reports that make it easy for you to kind of just audit these and go through them, especially when you're first launching them into production. I'm sure everybody's testing these thoroughly in the sandbox, I hope, but when you first launch them, you definitely want to have stuff ready. You don't want to have to go create it on the fly. Test, retest, test again, as always. Then I created some notifications and some dashboard components when some of these statuses were changed, just for my own peace of mind. So when I went live in my customer org, I literally had reports and dashboards that I checked like every half hour for the first couple of days, just to make sure everything was going smoothly. Just saves time. And that is what I had. Anybody have any questions on that?
How did you learn the flows? You said that you were good with process hinderance and you didn't want it to go to flow. I'm at this stage.
Yes. So I did a little bit with Trailhead. I was still really confused by it. So I basically voluntold one of my mentors that they were going to have a beer with me and help me understand flow. And he literally sat there and walked me through how to create one. To me, that's just the way I learn better. Like, reading stuff doesn't really apply for me when I'm trying to learn technical things, but when I see somebody do it hands-on, I can either replicate it myself, or I can at least ask the question of, okay, why did you do that step? That's what I don't understand, and I learn better that way. So don't be shy about doing that. Like, especially people here, speakers or your community group leaders. I've pinged people like on Twitter about random stuff that I just don't know how to do, like the people that are really good at automation or reports. That's what makes this community so good, is people are willing to do that. So don't be shy about asking for it. But yeah, for me, getting just a mentor was the way I got through it. Yeah. Anybody else have questions? Is that clear to everybody, like the two different kind of paths you have there? Cool. All right. Well, if you have any other questions, come up and see me. Otherwise, have a great rest of the event. Thank you for coming.